Oh, there's something in my chest that I can't hide. When feelings get involved, I'm terrified. 'Cause I've been here before and said goodbye. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? But you would give it one more try. Turn away and wrestle with my doubts. Oh, I leave them all behind, but don't know how. Bury my head deep within the crowd, but I'm reaching for your hand to pull me out. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? You can see straight through my life. Oh, there's something in my chest that I can't hide. When feelings get involved, I'm terrified. 'Cause I've been here before and said goodbye. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? But you would give it one more try. Turn away and wrestle with my doubts. Oh, I leave them all behind, but don't know how. Bury my head deep within the crowd, but I'm reaching for your hand to pull me out.
Okay, hello everybody. We are starting a little bit late tonight, but I get into the occult history. Time to do a little reading. I was trying out a game new to me, not new, but new to me, and got into it and lost track of time, but that's all right. So, I think this is another one of those long chapters. So it's 30 pages. I don't think I can get through 30 pages in one night, but we'll go for 15. So, okay. This is chapter 6 of part 2, the 19th century, magic and romanticism. In the first years of the 19th century, there died a man whose name deserves to be better known to students of mysticism and the occult. Louis Claude de Saint-Martin, the unknown philosopher. His immense significance is that he was midway between the traditional mystics of the East or West and a new evolutionism. His philosophy is informed with an extraordinary air of optimism. Man is fundamentally a god, says St. Martin, not a worm. In this atmosphere of health and light, his work resembles Swedenborg's. As the epigraph of my book, The Stature of Man, I quoted a passage that catches the essence of Martinism. Speaking of the idea that the Earth is a mere speck in the universe, he says, quote, "It is perhaps the wrong connection of ideas which has led men to the still falser notion that they are not worthy of their Creator's regard. They have believed themselves to be obeying the dictates of humility when they have denied that the Earth and all the universe exists only on man's account, on the ground that the admission of such an idea would be only conceit. But they have not been afraid of the laziness and cowardice which are the inevitable result of this affected modesty. The present day avoidance of the belief that we are the highest in the universe is the reason that we have not the courage to work to justify that title, that the duties springing from it seem too laborious, and that we would rather abdicate our position than realize them in all their consequences. Where is the pilot that will guide us between these hidden reefs of conceit and false humility?" End quote. Okay, sorry, okay, there we go. Marking the end point with my finger there. After studying the bewilderingly eventful lives of Casanova, Cagliostro, Saint Germain, John Dee, and the rest, it is a relief to come across a man to whom almost nothing happened. He was born in Amboise, in Touraine, in the same year as Cagliostro, 1743. His family were aristocrats of reasonable wealth, and although his mother died soon after his birth, his stepmother proved an excellent substitute, and he adored her. His family were devout Catholics, and he was sent to the College of Pont-l'Avoie while still very young. It was there that he discovered a book on self-knowledge by Abadi, and it seems to have exercised an enormous influence on his mind. He studied for the law and in due course was called to the bar, but he felt nothing but distaste for the affairs of everyday life, and managed to persuade his father to allow him to abandon the bar for the army. It may seem an odd choice, but he no doubt reasoned that an army commission in times of peace is something of a sinecure, and after the 7 Years' War and the Treaty of Paris, Europe was more or less at peace in 1766. the year St. Martin entered the army. In this he proved to be correct, for he was able to devote a great deal of time to study while his brother officers were out drinking. At the age of 24, when he was with his regiment in Bordeaux, St. Martin met the man who was to be the major influence in his life, Don Martin de Pascal de la Tour. Martin was a Rosicrucian of a peculiar kind. The Rosicrucians were a secret society bearing many resemblances to the Freemasons, but their emphasis was on occultism. They were said to be followers of Paracelsus. Most of the legends about their origins seem to be fabrications. They can all be found in A.E. Waite's Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross. But the notion of this mystical brotherhood, the thought of a worldwide society of magical adepts, seems to have satisfied some demand in the imagination of the 17th and 18th centuries. There were many small Rosicrucian societies all over the continent, many of them affiliated with the Freemasons. Don Martins was a member, perhaps the founder, of a curious group of Masonic Rosicrucians called the Elect Cohens. Martins had already established an order of so-called Illumines in Paris. Illuminism was another form of Rosicrucianism, but associated with political aims. It would be roughly correct to say that the Illuminists were to the Masons and Rosicrucians what the Jesuits were to the Catholic Church. Martins was something of a Cagliostro figure. He claimed to be a magical adept who had attained a very high level indeed. The ceremonies of his group included incantation in the manner of the Key of Solomon and a complex number mysticism, which differed in many basic respects from that mentioned in the last chapter. But all this magic was held to be only the means of attaining ultimate mystical illumination, which is no doubt why Don Martin liked to call his group Illumines, though they were non-political. Or Illumines, I'm not sure. St. Martin was initiated into the Elect Cohens in the second half of 1768. The effect was as deep as Cagliostro's induction in the Freemasons. St. Martin became a dedicated man. 3 years later, in 1771, he left the army and devoted the remainder of his life to mysticism. And although the master withdrew to Santo Domingo in the West Indies, dying in 1774, and although St. Martin became poverty-stricken as a consequence of the French Revolution, there was no deviation from this lifelong endeavor to bring to the world this vital insight that man is somehow a god who has forgotten his heritage and come to accept that he is a beggar. In St. Martin, this position does not involve the belief that there is no God. On the contrary, his philosophy is completely God-oriented. Being profoundly religious, he accepted the religion in which he had been brought up, but, like Swedenborg, interpreted Jesus and the Virgin in his own way. His mysticism was deeply influenced by Jacob Boehme, for whom his respect was so enormous that he placed him next to Jesus himself. But the core of his philosophy in this belief is the importance of man. He comes very close to Sir Julian Huxley's statement that man is now the managing director of evolution in the universe when he writes, quote, "The function of man differs from that of other physical beings, for it is the repair of the disorders of the universe." End quote. This notion of repairing is of central importance in his philosophy, and it explains the importance he attached to Jesus as the archetypal repairer. What fascinates St. Martin is that man keeps having quite clear flashes of godlike faculties. It is as if some dormant power awakened in him. Quote, "Man possesses innumerable vestiges of the faculties resident in the agent which produced him." End quote. This must not be taken as just another assertion that the kingdom of God is within us. It is far more exciting than that. If you believed that the engine of your car was completely dead due to some fundamental fault and you casually pushed the starter, expecting nothing, and the engine gave a cough and a roar, then stopped again, you would be excited because you would realize there is nothing fundamentally wrong with it after all. Without realizing it, man possesses immense powers. He is, quote, engendered from the fount of wonder and the fount of desire and intelligence, end quote. And his most vital faculty in this is his imagination. Imagination in the sense that Paracelsus used the word, the faculty for reaching beyond himself, beyond his everyday life. Man wears blinkers. Imagination is the power to see beyond them. Most men sit dully like sheep in a field, imagining that there is nothing to be done, that everyday reality is a kind of prison from which there is no escape except through drugs, drink, or suicide. In fact, the doors are open. Man's chief trouble is his curious passivity, which is like hypnosis. The beginning of his salvation are the glimpses of freedom that come in times of crisis or in moments of sudden ecstasy. Blake had spoken of the, quote, 5 windows that light the caverned man, end quote, the 5 senses, but added there is one through which he can pass, quote, he can pass out what time he will, end quote. St. Martin wrote, quote, the soul leaves the body only at death, but during life the faculties may extend beyond it and communicate with their exterior correspondences without ceasing to be united to their center, end quote. He is speaking about faculty X. At every moment man is freer than he realizes. St. Martin produced most of his books under the pseudonym The Unknown Philosopher. Living in a time of violence and of aggressive rationalism, he wanted to avoid drawing too much attention to himself. Besides, he was convinced that his writings would appeal only to a small audience. In this he was wrong. By the time he died at the age of 60, his health was always frail, Martinism was a European movement like Swedenborgianism or Freemasonry, and it continued to exercise considerable influence after his death. The Freemason who converts Peter in War and Peace, a real person called Bazdiv, was also a Martinist. It is a pity that he has been forgotten in our century, for his ideas are more relevant than ever. Unlike Cagliostro, St. Martin had no political influence on his time. By no stretch of the imagination can he be called a harbinger of the revolution, but he was a vital influence on a far greater revolution, the great movement called Romanticism. Romanticism, the new spirit created by Goethe, Schiller, Hoffmann, Wordsworth, Shelley, Berlioz, was the artistic expression of the mysticism of Claude de Saint-Martin. Underlying it all are those glimpses, those moments when the engine starts up for a moment. Romanticism is based on moments of ecstasy. And what is ecstasy? Perhaps the least controversial definition would be a sudden bubbling up and overflowing of pent-up emotion. And when a man experiences ecstasy, all commonness disappears. He is rocked in a cradle of delight, and life is almost unbearably sweet. It is in such moments that he realizes that what a poor thing his skinny, starved, everyday consciousness is. The Romantics were driven by the spirit of magic, which is the evolutionary spirit of the human race. It was Fichte, Fichte, who noted the basic paradox of Romanticism. Quote, to be free is nothing, to become free is heavenly, end quote. Frei sein ist nichts, frei werden ist der Himmel. I know my pronunciation of German is terrible, but I'm more comfortable pronouncing it than any other foreign language. When you have freedom, you yawn and take it for granted, because man's will is mostly in neutral gear. When you suddenly become free after a long period of misery and bondage, everything is delightful and life seems infinitely rich. It is the same when you suddenly get something you want very badly. Even the most mediocre male gets a glimpse of the immensity of freedom as a girl yields to him for the first time. This is why Casanova and Frank Harris and the author of My Secret Life spent their lives in pursuit of sex. They were after the flashes of lightning that reveal man's freedom. The romantic with the most powerful obsession with magic was E.T.A. Hoffmann, known to most modern readers through Offenbach's opera The Tales of Hoffmann. In him, it is possible to see at once the weakness and the peculiar strength of the romantics. They're just checking the okay. Their chief weakness was that they did not think, but their strength was an ability to be carried along on a flood of emotion that took them a long way toward mystical insight. The Romantics used the imagination to release pent-up frustrations and to conjure up the kind of world they would like to live in. Agrippa, Paracelsus, Cagliostro were unhappy wanderers. The Romantics were wanderers in a world of imagination. Quote, I traveled through a land of men and women too, and heard and saw such dreadful things as cold earth wanderers never knew. End quote. Wrote William Blake in The Mental Traveler. In his masterpiece The Golden Pot, Hoffmann creates a weird farrago of myth, magic, and alchemy. Everything that happens to its hero, the student Anselmus, is the wish-fulfillment fantasy of a frustrated magician. A clumsy, preoccupied young man, he sits beneath a tree on the riverbank and hears magic snakes whispering to him of love and another reality. The eccentric archivist Lindhorst hires him to copy magical manuscripts for him, and he realizes that Lindhorst is a salamander exiled from Atlantis for falling in love with a green snake. The snakes in the tree are Lindhorst's daughters, and the youngest, Serpentina, is in love with the student. However, so is the daughter of the dean of the university, Veronica, who expects Anselmus to rise one day to the rank of privy councillor. There is the fundamental situation, the tug of war between the world of magic and the boring real world, which is disappointing, whether it's offering you success or drudgery. The world thinks Anselmus insane. What could be the objection to settling down with a beautiful girl and accepting a comfortable job through the good offices of her father? And can he trust the strange visions conjured up by the half-mad Lindhorst and his wild talk about how the youth Phosphorus embraced a white lily and fought with a black dragon? When the university registrar interrupts Lindhorst with a request that he tell them a true story instead, Lindhorst declares that this is the truest story he can possibly tell them. It corresponds to a deeper level of reality than this dreary, repetitive world, and in the end, Anselmus has the courage to choose Lindhorst and Serpentina rather than Veronica, and the rank of privy councillor. And in most of Hoffmann's stories, this decision would lead to tragedy, but in this, his most fantastic tale, he allows Anselmus and Serpentina to live happy ever after in Atlantis. In this story occurs one of Hoffmann's most striking symbols. At one point, Anselmus finds himself corked up in a glass bottle standing on a shelf. In other bottles, there are church scholars and law clerks, and they all look perfectly happy. When he asks them how they can be so cheerful, confined in a glass bottle, they reply that he must be joking. They are standing on the Elbe Bridge looking down into the water, and later on they intend to go and have a drink in the tavern. The episode plays no real part in the story and has obviously been inserted because Hoffmann thought it so important. Most people are unaware that they are imprisoned in a glass bottle. They are convinced they are free. It is the misfortune of the man of deeper perceptions to realize that he is imprisoned. But this image also points to the central fault of all the romantics. They are pessimists and defeatists. They see no way out of the glass bottle except into the unreal world of imagination, which weakens its devotees and makes them unfit for real life. With the exception of Goethe, the Romantics seem unaware of that other form that ecstasy takes, the violent, raging appetite for more life. There are moods in which the whole world seems so beautiful that man feels he can plow through life like a tank, smashing down every obstacle. Our usual state is one of poor appetite. We are like a man recovering from a long bout of retching, feeling that he never wants to eat another large meal. In moments of intensity, he develops an enormous appetite and feels as if he could keep on eating for a week. Everything in the world is fascinating, including an old tramp blowing his nose in the gutter and the smell of gasworks beside the canal. This is ultimately the reason we have to reject the Romantics. Wrapped in self-pity, they fail to stay the course. It seems to be almost a law that we have to accept one unsatisfactory extreme or another. The magician who gets too involved in the world, or the romantic who is afraid to get involved. But at least the Romantic revival brought a magic revival with it. The 19th century was a noisy industrial century, a century of dirt, smoke, bad drains, sooty chimneys, but also of railroads, canals, exploration, of good beef and good beer, and of the great exhibitions of Paris and London, the Crystal Palace, the England of Dickens and Cobbett, the France of Flaubert and Maupassant. It was perhaps the most energetic century in mankind's history, and in all the frantic money-making and empire-building, 95% of mankind was pushed against the wall. Hence the revival of magic, which is fundamentally a revolt against coarse-grained reality. The country in which this first occurred was France. Strangely enough, the man who gave it impetus was that arch historian of money-makers and go-getters, Honore Balzac. Balzac had a strong mystical leaning which emerges in such works as Louis Lambert, Seraphita, and The Quest for the Absolute. But for Louis Lambert, as for Balthazar Claes, the hero of the last novel, the quest of the absolute ends in death, not in triumph. In 1810, when Balzac was only 11 years old, there was born in Paris the man who was to become the source of the modern revival of magic, Alphonse Louis Constant, who wrote his books under the name Eliphas Levi. The parish priest was impressed by his intelligence and was instrumental in having him sent to St. Sulpice. In due course, Constant became a priest, but within a few years he was thrown out of the priesthood for preaching doctrines contrary to the church. Exactly what these were has not come down to us. In his late 20s, a literary friend, Alphonse Esquiros, took him along to hear a strange prophet called Ganot, an aged man who wore a woman's cloak and babbled about the creation of the universe and the fall of man to a group of disciples. Constant describes him in the History of Magic, quote, a bearded man of majestic demeanor. He was surrounded by several men, bearded and ecstatic like himself, and in addition there was a woman with motionless features who seemed like an entranced somnambulist. The prophet's manner was abrupt and yet sympathetic. He had hallucinated eyes and an infectious quality of eloquence. He spoke with emphasis, warmed to his subject quickly, chafed and fumed till a white froth gathered on his lips. End quote. The entranced woman was Ganot's wife, whom he believed to be a reincarnation of Marie Antoinette. He believed that he was a reincarnation of Louis XVII. After Ganot's death, his wife continued to be convinced that she was Marie Antoinette, becoming indignant only if anyone questioned it. Constant and Esquiros, who had gone to Ganot's attic to laugh, were overcome by his eloquence and became his disciples. I have quoted Levy's description of Gano not because it is of any historical importance, but because it gives something of the flavor of Paris in the mid-century. All the talk of ecstasy and occultism and revolt. Levy even has an extraordinary story of a disciple of Gano's called Sobriere, who one day in 1848 began shouting on a street corner, advising the people to march to the Boulevard de Capucines and express their dissatisfaction directly to the ministers. Finally, half Paris was marching behind him, whereupon he slipped away. The mob stopped before the Hôtel de Capucines. Someone fired a shot at them, and suddenly the revolution had started. Sobriere had played his part in history in an almost trance-like state. At 30, Constant married a girl of 16, Noemi Noemi, who bore him 2 children and subsequently left him. He was drawn increasingly to the study of magic, although he made some sort of a living on the edge of the literary world. In 1856 there appeared his Dogma and Ritual of High Magic, one of the books Ouspensky kept in his drawer when reporting the Hague Conference. These were followed by A History of Magic and a number of other books on occult subjects. Disciples and pupils gathered round him, and he died at the age of 65 in 1875, having started a magical revival virtually single-handed. He admits that his own inspiration was Balzac's Louis Lambert, Balzac's study of a brilliant, highly strung young mystic. It must be admitted that Levy's books do not inspire confidence, for what he was claiming is, unfortunately, a lie. Quote, "Behind the veil of all the hieratic and mystical allegories of ancient doctrines, behind the darkness and strange ordeals of all initiations, under the seal of all sacred writings, in the ruins of old Nineveh or Thebes, on the crumbling stones of old temples, and on the blackened visage of the Assyrian or Egyptian Sphinx, in the monstrous or marvelous paintings which interpret to the faithful of India the inspired pages of the Vedas, in the cryptic emblems of our old books on alchemy, in the ceremonies practiced at reception by all secret societies, there are found indications of a doctrine which is everywhere the same and everywhere carefully concealed." I don't think I agree with 1971 Colin Wilson on saying that that's a lie. I think Levy may have been onto something like certain people nowadays are pointing out. Anyway, moving on. This passage reveals a highly romantic imagination and little else. It is not true that there is a secret doctrine known only to adepts. The Stone Age shamans did not possess a secret doctrine, only a curious oneness with nature and a contact with man's subconscious powers. There is no secret doctrine apart from science, as we have clearly seen in the course of this book. I don't think we have. Pythagoras, Agrippa, Paracelsus thought of themselves as scientists, and they also happened to possess a certain degree of shamanistic powers. This is not to deny that magical ceremonies work. They do. Raynor C. Johnson mentions a description of George and Helen Sandwith of firewalking in Fiji, an annual ceremony. Quote, "The essential feature appears to have been that those who participated had to be fully charged with some unknown type of energy, presumably generated on the etheric level. And 10 days of ritual preparation were devoted to this. Numerous tests were made before the culminating event. Their flesh was pierced by skewers without the feeling of pain or loss of blood, and they were lashed with pain without pain being felt or wheals appearing. The same energy appears to have remarkable therapeutic powers, and the case is described of the almost instantaneous healing of a Hindu girl whose legs had been paralyzed from birth. For the firewalking ceremony, 40 tons of logs were burned, and the heat is so great that their faces had to be shielded from scorching at 12 feet. One of the firewalkers remarked to the Sandwiths, quote, "This is something that really works. It is not just talk and promises." End quote. The evidence for such feats is beyond dispute, but it does not prove that the 10 days of ritual preparation involve some secret doctrine. Whatever the ritual, its aim is to put the shaman in contact with the etheric energy that Johnson mentions. He also mentions that tragedies have occurred due to insufficient preparation. And so Eliphas Levi's books are based on a false premise. Even A.E. Waite, who translated them, himself not the most reliable of historians of magic, feels impelled to warn the reader that Levi uses his imagination too much. His aim is to impress his readers with his own knowledge of the secret doctrines, of the Kabbalah, etc. In fact, he knew little or no Hebrew. In short, he is another in a long line of magical charlatans. This is not to say that he is no more than a confidence man. He studied magic and believed in it, and even E.M. Butler, who remarks that his so-called science, quote, becomes more transparently bogus with every page one turns, end quote, is willing to accept his account of raising the spirit of Apollonius of Tyana, as described in chapter 13 of Transcendental Magic. According to Levi, a mysterious lady, an adept, showed him her magical cabinet and asked him to evoke the spirit of Apollonius to ask it a question. The cabinet was a room in a turret with concave mirrors, a marble altar, a copper tripod, and a white lambskin rug. He observed a vegetarian diet for 3 weeks before the invocation and had to fast completely for the last 7 days. During all this time he meditated on Apollonius and held imaginary conversation with him. At the end of 12 hours of magic incantations, all detailed in the appendix of Transcendental Magic, the shade of Apollonius appeared in a kind of gray shroud. It vanished several times, apparently objecting to the sword Levi was wearing, and at one point touched his arm, which remained numb for days. It answered his 2 questions telepathically, prophesying death for the subjects of both. Afterwards, Levi says, quote, "Something of another world had passed into me. I was no longer either sad or cheerful, but I felt a singular attraction towards death, unaccompanied, however, by any suicidal tendency." End quote. He claimed to have invoked the shade on 2 subsequent occasions and learned 2 important Kabbalistic secrets. He adds, however, that he does not believe that the shade was necessarily Apollonius, but that the whole manifestation was a kind of drunkenness of the imagination. Bearing in mind Paracelsus's concept of the imagination, we need not take this to be a total disclaimer of a genuine occult experience. In fact, he adds that he quote, did see and did touch apart from dreaming, and this is sufficient to establish the real efficacy of magical ceremonies, end quote. And at the beginning of the chapter on necromancy, he remarks sonorously, quote, "Eliphas Levi Zahed, who writes this book, has evoked and he has seen," end quote. Levi exerted a considerable influence upon the novelist Bulwer Lytton, who became something of a disciple, and the description of the magician in The Haunted and the Haunters is a fanciful portrait of Levi. There are also echoes of him in A Strange Story, Zanoni, and The Coming Race, the first of which is a classic of occultism and suspense that has been oddly neglected in our own time. One of the focal points of Levi's magical doctrine is the notion of the astral light, Levi's name for the invisible magical ether that we have encountered in other occultists, and which he describes as a force more powerful than steam. In Leighton's novel The Coming Race, this appears as vril, a magical form of energy. It is an amusing thought that the manufacturers of Bovril beef extract borrowed Leighton's word and united it with a cow to form the name of their product. Levy's astral light lives on. It was Bulwer Lytton who made the idea of occultism fashionable in England and was chiefly responsible for the magical revival that involved Mathers, Yeats, Crowley, Waite, Dion Fortune, et al. The revival might have started 50 years earlier if a certain Francis Barrett had been a better writer in 1801. Barrett published a large study of ritual magic called the Magus, whose portraits of demons may still be found in most histories of magic and witchcraft, and in an advertisement at the end of the book appealed for students and disciples to help him create a magic circle. But the book is dull if informative, and cannot bear comparison with Levy. The Reverend Montague Summers, that credulous historian of witchcraft and vampirism, asserts that Barrett did succeed in founding a circle and that Cambridge subsequently became something of a magic center as a consequence. What should by now be quite clear is that the spirit of magic underwent a complete transformation in the 19th century. With Paracelsus, it had been a science. With Cagliostro, it became the instrument of his religion of the regeneration of mankind. But with Levy and Leighton, it became a romantic literary property surrounded by dense clouds of incense. Goethe's Faust turns to magic because he is sick of his human limitations, and he wants to explore those moments of godlike intensity that St. Martin wrote about. 19th century man found himself high and dry in a materialistic and boring world. In the Middle Ages, devils were a reality that everybody accepted without question, hence the morbid fascination aroused by the legend of Theophilus. Now the shadows were gone, the common daylight made everything hard and clear, and the romantics looked back nostalgically to the age of demons and incubi, altogether more stimulating to the imagination than railways and paddle steamers. The universal complaint was boredom. In Obermann, 1804, Etienne de Senancour created a Byronic hero who broods among the mountains of Switzerland upon man's inadequacy and his own failure to establish contact with the magnificence of nature. The real problem of life is not its misery, but its meaninglessness. He remarks that cloudy weather makes him feel sad, but when the sun comes out it strikes him as useless. He feels tired and without desire. He is neither happy nor unhappy. Even unhappiness would be a relief from the dullness. See, we're going to go 4 more pages. Well, 5 more pages. 150 years before Samuel Beckett, Obermann sits waiting for Godot, or Godot, Godot. This feeling of futility and boredom was the foundation of the occult revival. But what about the feeling that man possesses godlike powers? The feeling that is obviously based on reality, if the claims of the Fiji firewalkers are true. What is it that the most intelligent men like Obermann and like Matthew Arnold, who wrote a poem about him, are crippled by a feeling of helplessness, of contingency, of being a mere plaything of forces greater than themselves? There can be only one answer, because they are mere rationalists, obsessed by the scientific view of nature. Men like Bulwer Lytton and Eliphas Levi recognized this instinctively and took steps to combat it, hence the magical revival. But the really explosive impetus for the revival came from America. A completely new epoch in the history of occultism opened on the evening of March 31st, 1848, in the house of the Fox family in the town of Arcadia, Wayne County, New York. For some time the family had been disturbed by rapping noises, and on this evening the two Fox girls, aged 12 and 15, asked the mysterious knocker to repeat noises made by snapping their fingers. The spirit did so. 12 days later, a roomful of neighbors heard a man called William Dusler ask the spirit questions which were answered by raps. The spirit said that it had been murdered for money and buried in the cellar. Digging in the cellar later produced some decayed human remains, which were presumably those of the peddler who had been murdered by a previous tenant of the house. It was then discovered that the Fox sisters seemed to incite rapping noises wherever they went. A relative of the Foxes later declared that it was all fraudulent, produced somehow by the girls cracking their double joints. But by that time, spirit rapping had caught on and spread all over America. Undoubtedly, much of it was fraudulent. Equally certainly, much was genuine. These phenomena will be discussed more thoroughly in the third part of this book. They are mentioned here only to introduce one of the most flamboyant figures in the history of occultism, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, H.P. Blavatsky. Petrovna. I can never remember her middle name. I always want to say Petrova. It's Petrovna. She was born Helena Hahn, the daughter of a Russian colonel, in 1831, and she was the cousin of Sergei Witte. It's Witt, but with an E on the end, so I'm not sure. Witte. Later Prime Minister and friend of Rasputin. She seems to have been an explosive madcap. Married at 16 to a man 24 years her senior, she deserted him after a while, the marriage still unconsummated, and began her wanderings around the world. Count Witte said she became a bareback rider in a circus, taught the piano in Paris and London, became assistant to the medium Daniel Dunglas' home for a while, managed an artificial flower factory in Tiflis, and periodically turned up at her home in Ekaterinoslav, looking plumper and stranger than ever. She had been beautiful as a young girl, with curly dark hair, a large sensual mouth, and great azure eyes. She soon put on weight, reaching 16.5 stone, 232 pounds, in middle age. But no matter how much her bulk increased, she never lost a gentle, feminine, appealing quality. It comes out even in her last photograph. She also traveled, according to her own account, in Mexico, Texas, India, Canada, and Tibet. The last was almost impossible for a woman to enter, and she was turned back twice. The circus job seems to have ruined her sex life. She fell off a horse and displaced her womb, which a doctor certified later made abstention unavoidable. She later declared, quote, "I am lacking something, and the place is filled up with some crooked cucumber," end quote. Returning to Italy from Greece in her 40th year, the Eumonia blew up, and only 17 of its 400 passengers survived. She described limbs and heads falling around her as she swam. I always thought she had one kid by the guy she married, and that's partly why she had the money she had to go travel, because he was still, she may have deserted him, but he was still basically financing her. And also, he doesn't mention how she got her education, which is odd. He didn't mention it at all. My understanding is she was raised by an uncle who had a fantastic library, including a lot of magical stuff, alchemy and stuff, and she read all of it. Basically devoured his whole library before she was married off and subsequently deserted the guy. Anyway, moving on. She enters the history of occultism some 2 years later. It is true that she seems to have acquired some reputation as a medium in Russia, but details are lacking. In 1873, she went to America and found the country in the grip of the spiritualist craze. It had progressed a long way since the Fox sisters and produced rappings 20 years had produced rappings 20 years earlier. Now the spirits turned tables, made articles of furniture fly around the room, played musical instruments, and even materialized at seances. Two brothers named Eddie were the most prominent materialization mediums, and it was at their farm near Chittenden, Vermont, that Madame Blavatsky met a bearded lawyer who possessed the honorary rank of colonel, Henry Steele Olcott. Olcott was a bearded, gentle, naive American with eyes that tended to look in opposite directions. He was much taken with Madame Blavatsky, whose character was certainly striking. She was enormously vital, direct of speech, as the remark about the crooked cucumber demonstrates, a nervous chain smoker who often smoothed her nerves with marijuana, which was not illegal in those sensible times. He said, and capable of colorful and imaginative profanity. The bumbling, serious-minded colonel found her a magnet. He wrote about her in a newspaper for which he was a correspondent, and saw much of her when she returned to New York. Other newspapers interviewed her because she was good copy. There was no romantic involvement with the colonel. In fact, she married a young Georgian named Michael Bettinelli, 7 years her junior, on his promise that he should not try to invade her bed. When he failed to keep it, they separated. She was breezily indifferent to the existence of her Russian husband, Vice Governor Blavatsky. She is admittedly on record as saying that sexual love is, quote, a beastly appetite that should be starved into submission, end quote. Madame Blavatsky had definite mediumistic powers. Throughout her life, acquaintances spoke of strange knocks and rappings that occurred in her presence. The colonel was glad to call upon her help when it was a question of investigating mediums suspected of fraud. For example, a couple named Holmes, who were accused of hiring a Mrs. Eliza White to impersonate a materialized spirit called Katie King. The famous socialist Robert Owen was much taken with Katie King and gave her presents of jewelry, which Katie took back with her to the spirit world. With Madame Blavatsky's help, Olcott was able to tell his readers in a book called People from the Other World that the Holmeses and Katie King were undoubtedly genuine. It was clear to H.P. Blavatsky, as she became known to her admirers, HPB, that her future was tied up with spiritualism. The trouble was that it was already becoming less fashionable, and a spiritualist newspaper she helped launch soon failed. She and the colonel started a miracle club, which was basically simply another seance group, but this did not prosper. The colonel was a total believer in HPB's powers, and he contributed greatly to her support in the year after he met her. Occasionally, when he was with her, notes dropped out of the air detailing her needs, and she explained that they were from certain secret Mahatmas she had met in Tibet, spiritual adepts who would one day regenerate the world. The colonel always followed these instructions. There was also a Brotherhood of Luxor in these early days. HPB tended to emphasize Egypt rather than Tibet, whose members sent messages to the readers of the Banner of Light, the spiritualist newspaper that publicized her doings in exchange for a certain amount of financial support. It was one of the Luxor Brotherhood who suggested that the colonel should leave his wife and 3 children and move into the same building as Madame Blavatsky. The marriage was not entirely happy, and he was glad to follow the suggestion. It was on September 7th, 1875, that Madame Blavatsky embarked on the career that was to make her world famous. A certain Mr. Felt had lectured to a small study group about the hermetic secrets embodied in the measurements of the pyramids. He explained that these secret laws of proportion could also invoke spirits, although he added the spirits he had seen showed no sign of intelligence. The colonel suggested that perhaps they ought to form a society to study this kind of thing. HPB nodded vigorously, and during the next week they thought of a name for it, the Theosophical Society. The word was not invented by HPB. It had been in use as a synonym for mysticism for centuries. For example, Bishop Martenson refers to Jacob Boehm's system as a theosophy in his classic book on Boehm, 1882. Okay, but this is 1875. Whatever. But after HPV, theosophy meant primarily a curious system of Eastern and Western mysticism, secret doctrine, and spiritualism. As soon as the society was formed, HPB set out to write its Bible. She wrote endlessly, day after day, chain-smoking and occasionally glancing up to read some book held out for her by spirits. The result, Isis Unveiled, came out in 2 volumes in September 1877 and sold amazingly well. An incredibly erudite work, blending doctrines from the Kabbalah, Cornelius Agrippa, Pythagoras, Buddhist, Hindu, and Taoist scripture. Isis Unveiled can still be studied with enjoyment, if only for the extraordinary boldness of its conceptions. We have already touched upon her doctrine of root races in discussing Atlantis. The first root race lived near the North Pole, and they were invisible, being made of fire mist. The second, living in northern Asia, were just visible. They invented sexual intercourse. The third root race was the ape-like giants of Lemuria, who communicated telepathically and could not reason in one sense. The fourth were the Atlanteans, who were destroyed through black magic. We are the fifth, and according to the occultist Lewis Spence, we are also heading the way of Atlantis. The sixth root race will evolve from the present human race and will live on Lemuria in the Pacific. Again, after the seventh root race, life will leave our Earth and start up on Mercury. Buried in all these remarkable assertions, there is the vitally important notion that man is in a privileged position. It is true that his spirit is trapped in an unprecedented weight of flesh, but he possesses the will and intellect to cope with it. He could, with confidence and courage, become godlike. For 3 years, the Theosophical Society more or less flourished in America. Then HPB decided that interest was declining and that they should go to India. An odd coincidence prompted this decision. In 1870, the colonel had met an Indian named Mulji Thackeray on shipboard. 7 years later, the colonel happened to be talking to a friend who had just returned from India, and he asked him if by any chance he had met Thackeray. His friend had indeed. He even had his address. Alcott wrote to him about the Theosophical Society. Thackeray wrote back about a new Indian religious movement called the Arya Samaj, started by a remarkable teacher called Swami Dayananda Sarasvati. Alcott also wrote to the Swami, and soon the Theosophical Society had accepted the idea of amalgamation with the Arya Samaj, and when, not long after, Daniel Douglas Home made some slighting remarks about Madame Blavatsky and her society in one of his books, she decided to leave the treacherous and unspiritual West and seek light in India. The trip began badly: seasickness, heat, and a large bill for expenses from the president of the Bombay Arya Samaj, which made HPB erupt into a volcano of profanity. All the same, they had made the right choice. India was getting tired of British domination. These cultured Westerners, who thought that the wisdom of India was preferable to the technology of the white man, were a great moral boost. Swami Dayananda found them naive and too interested in occult phenomena, but the rest of Bombay accepted them with enthusiasm. Their magazine, The Theosophist, sold better than it had ever done in America. The tide was all in their favor, even though there were aspects of India they found jarring. One old gentleman of high rank brought a pretty 10-year-old girl into the room, and HPB smiled charmingly, but when he said, "Allow me to present you to my little wife," she roared, "You old beast, you ought to be ashamed of yourself." Yeah, no shit, a 10-year-old girl? Pedophile is what that is. Her occult powers seemed to increase. She caused a shower of roses to fall on the heads of a company of scholars and pandits. What's a pandit? I don't know. I'll have to look that up. Made a lamp flame rise and fall merely by pointing at it, and materialized a cup and a saucer at a picnic. On this last occasion, 2 Englishmen suggested that Madame Blavatsky might have buried the cup and saucer in the place where they had been found, and HPB was so angry that she seemed to take leave of her senses. Nevertheless, she agreed to provide further proof of her powers, or rather the Mahatma's, that evening. She asked their hostess if there was anything she particularly wanted, and the hostess mentioned a brooch lost some years ago. After asking her to envisage it clearly, HPB announced that the masters had deposited it in a flower bed outside. The company went into the garden, dug among the flowers, and unearthed the brooch. A new disciple, A.P. Sinnett, asked if he might be allowed to correspond with the Mahatmas, and HPB said it might be possible. Sinnett gave her a letter to be transmitted, and a few days later he found a reply on his desk from a master who called himself Kuthumi Lal Singh. Another disciple, A.O. Hume, wrote to Kuthumi and also received an answer. The letters from Kuthumi continued until there were enough of them to publish in a volume. They are at present preserved in the British Museum in 7 volumes. Wow. Sinnett and Hume certainly had no doubt whatever that the letters came from a secret master in the Himalayas. On one occasion they asked him whether it would not be possible to establish direct contact with him instead of having to use HPB as a mailbox. The result, after this letter had been handed, sealed to HPB, was a violent scene in which her profanity reached a new level of colorful invectiveness. So, that is the halfway point in this chapter. That's where I'm going to stop, and we will pick it up Tuesday. We'll finish out the chapter, and then that takes us to the Beast himself, which of course is going to be about Aleister Crowley, the Great Beast, the Great Beast 666, the wickedest man in the world, all of the stuff that we've all heard about him. And let's see how long that chapter is going to be. Is it the Beast himself? Okay. So it is 25 pages. So I don't know if I'll be able to make it through all 25 in one. We may have to break it up too, but that's okay. Good book. I'm liking it. way better than the Atlantis and the Kingdom of the Neanderthals book that we read of his. If it's the same Colin Wilson, I'm assuming it's the same Colin Wilson. But this one is a much better book than that one was. Although it was very interesting. I was just disappointed that it was really kind of a clickbaity type title. But anyway, to use the modern terms, that'll be that. I'm not sure if I don't think I'm going to play Greedfall. I did last night. I'll play again tomorrow. Oh, hello, Darian. HMG. I just saw that you were there. I was so focused on the book. Sorry for not seeing it earlier, but welcome in. Thank you. I hope to see you again. And that'll be that for tonight. I will see you all next time.
Is I know the pieces. One is broken, one is because I have seen apart. I have known about the play. I didn't have anything to say. Follow your heart, don't say if you leave it behind. Someone will break. I left you my heart. What did you do? You used to you left me all shy. Was my love? Was it love? You have no answers. Don't know without you. How will I survive? If you